All righty. Well, here we go. We've got a lot of folks trickling in here. So, as always, we understand that some people are hopping from one Zoom call to the next. It's also a nice sunny day here. And so, we appreciate anybody who's joining a Zoom call to learn about a general rate case on a day like today. So, I'm going to start just with a brief land acknowledgement as well as an overview of how this webinar is going to proceed. Allow for a few more minutes for folks to trickle in, and then we can get started with just introductions and really dive into the meat of the topic here, which again is the Chugach Electric Association general rate case we have in front of the Regulatory Commission of Alaska today. But as promised, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement, and really in this moment, soon after Indigenous Peoples Day, and then also in the midst of AFN, perhaps right now is one of the more mindful moments for us in terms of really uplifting the beautiful cultures, the innovative practices, and also the history of stewardship of these lands that Alaska Native peoples have shown for time immemorial. Although it is also Alaska Day, where we're supposed to celebrate the sale of these unceded lands from one country to the next. And so I just implore, as we gather here and work to follow their lead and contribute our time and efforts to the shared challenge of building a just transition to a sustainable future fueled by renewable energy and energy efficiency here in Alaska, REAP's mission. We implore you to take note of this heightened awareness that we have in this moment and make a habit of it and carry it forward with you. And so with that, I want to encourage folks to share their name, affiliation, and also the native lands that you're zooming in from in the webinar chat below. Should have that functionality available to folks who are joining us. Also wanted to officially welcome you to the first installment of our Fall Energy Speaker Series. I'll share a bit about the next installment at the end of this webinar, but really appreciate you joining us for this first one here today. Also wanted to thank our sponsor, Cook Inlet Region Inc., or CIRI, for sponsoring the event and bringing it for free to folks who are joining us virtually this afternoon. As I mentioned, this is an hour-long webinar. We'll begin with brief introductions, followed by about 40 minutes or so of moderated discussion before we open it up for 15 minutes or so of Q&A at the end. In order to ensure that I don't miss your important questions, I encourage everybody to use the Q&A function at the bottom there. That'll give me a list of all of your questions so that I can read through them and make sure that Antony and Marge are able to answer them in a timely fashion. And then I also wanted to answer one popular question that always crops up. We are recording this webinar and we'll be making it available on the REAP YouTube channel and website afterwards. So thank you for joining, and no need to sort of record it on your own end or try and remember everything that we discussed today, because we'll make that available afterwards. So now for brief introductions, you all hopefully know who REAP is. Joining us today for our first installment of our Energy Speaker Series, but just wanted to give a brief introduction to the organization for folks who maybe aren't aware. Renewable Energy Alaska Project, or REAP. We are a statewide nonprofit dedicated to the mission of increasing the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency, collectively clean energy in the state of Alaska. We do that through collaboration, education, training, and advocacy. We're also a member-based organization with a diverse coalition of over 60 dues-paying members comprised of renewable energy developers, businesses, nonprofits, electric utilities, Alaska Native entities, local governments, and even educational institutions. So really a broad coalition, all working to achieve that vision that we have set for our organization. Typically, as I mentioned, we engage in policy, but more through the lens of legislative research, drafting, and advocacy. And specifically sort of legislative advocacy in Juneau. But as we'll discuss today, rate design, which is at the heart of today's topic, is all about policy. It determines who pays and how much for their electricity. And so until recently, REAP has not had the capacity to effectively engage in that sort of advocacy. But thankfully, that changed since Dr. Antony Scott joined the team. Antony is our Director of Economic and Regulatory Affairs. He joined us just over a year ago. And I'm hoping, Antony, that you might just give us a brief introduction to your background and how you come to this work here at REAP.
Sure. Well, the truncated version is I did academic work actually in public utility regulation at University of Wisconsin, which has got a deep history in the area. I mean, it goes back well over 100 years. And I came to Alaska in 2000, my first job out of graduate school as the staff economist at the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. And I served as a commissioner there most recently. My term ended last April. So that's my background in regulatory economics. Done a bunch of other things too.
Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, we're very pleased to have you on the team and excited to sort of harness that expertise as we talk about this sometimes weedsy but very important topic today. But first off, I wanted to introduce Marge Stoneking, who's the Director of Advocacy for AARP Alaska, and wanted to invite you, Marge, to introduce yourself and also AARP.
Thank you, Donovan. Well, AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization also, and we serve Americans 50 and older. AARP has more than 75,000 members in Alaska. 30,000 of those are in Anchorage. We have a broad mission focused in the areas of health security, financial resilience, social connection, and livable communities, so that Alaskans can choose how they live as they age. We have a very small state office staff, advocates across the state in varying capacities of volunteer teams in larger communities on the road system and also in Southeast. Alaska staff and volunteers accomplish our work through education, engagement, and public policy advocacy. Personally, I've been with AARP Alaska for 3 years, but have 2 decades of experience in policy advocacy on behalf of nonprofit missions. Most of that time I served as executive director of the American Lung Association in Alaska. At AARP, I am the Alaska Advocacy Director, and I'm responsible for our advocacy agenda and impact. At the state level, state office level, we're focused primarily also on legislative advocacy, and we've been active in the areas of health, caregiving, and financial security. Utility advocacy is brand new to AARP Alaska, but we do have expertise and experience nationally and in several other states where AARP has raised its voice on rate cases. I want to thank REAP for the invitation to join as a guest in today's webinar. Though our reasons for being involved and our missions are different, we both oppose what's been proposed by Chugach, and we'll get into those reasons today. And I'm happy to share with you AARP's high-level position on that matter when we get there. But you will primarily hear from Antony today as he brings the local expertise and experience on this issue, as you heard, as well as the educational background. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marge. And as one who always likes to undersell himself, I appreciate that. But I also, there's a reason that we invited you to contribute today, and we're so glad to have you and AARP represented here. And as I mentioned earlier, we're hoping this will be a high-level conversation and a moderated discussion, not so much a presentation and no materials to share. So I've got points that I would like to hit, but I also encourage our speakers to sort of bring it in the direction that they think is most relevant to our audience here. But I will say, as I mentioned earlier, REAP is a statewide nonprofit, works with a bunch of different communities, both on and off the rail belt. And so I was hoping to just sort of start more broadly and perhaps ask you, either of you, to sort of go into just the background here and specifically start with who is Chugach Electric and sort of what is this moment that we're in here right now. Perhaps, Antony, you could give us just an introduction to Chugach Electric Association.
Sure. Chugach Electric is Alaska's largest electric utility, serves something like 40% of the state's population. They're the largest in terms of customers, in terms of what they generate, and also in terms of employees. They are a nonprofit member cooperative. It's interesting that in the rail belt, we economically regulate cooperatives. It's not that common. In America, outside, co-ops are frequently not regulated at all. But our co-ops in the rail belt are, and when the question has been put to their members as to whether they want to not have RCA oversight, the answer that their members have returned over the decades has been consistently no.
Great. And then, so on that point, we are here to talk about Chugach Electric's general rate case in front of the Regulatory Commission. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just sort of at a high level explain to us what a rate case is and what's going on here today?
Sure. So a rate case is basically a litigated proceeding in front of the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, which is an expert administrative agency, in which Chugach will, one, explain why they need to raise their base rates. And their base rates are what they charge irrespective of how many kilowatt hours actually get generated. There's another rate which we're all billed monthly, and which Chugach has adjusted every 3 months since the acquisition of ML&P, and those are what are called the cost of power adjustment. And so our rates have been changing every 3 months or so, but those changes reflect only the costs of fuel. This general rate case will address Chugach's need to generate revenue to cover its fixed costs of doing business. So the return on and of capital in terms of their debt service. They need to recover depreciable expenses. They've got operating expenses in terms of the people they employ. And so what they have come and asked the commission for is a increase in the overall revenues that they need to collect from their base rates of a little over 8%.
Got it. And so
that's the first thing that a rate case addresses, is what's called the revenue requirement. Okay, so utilities are allowed the opportunity to collect in rates what they need to cover their costs, including capital costs. And so the revenue requirement is the phrase which describes those costs. There are 2 other key parts of a rate case, a general rate case like Chugach has filed. The first part involves a cost of service study in which the utility takes that total amount of revenue that they need to collect, let's call it $100, and they make determinations on how much of that revenue they should collect from residential ratepayers, how much of it they should collect from small commercial customers, how much they should collect from large commercial customers, and how much they should collect from industrial customers, broadly speaking, and lighting and this and that. But broadly speaking, that's the next phase, is you take your overall revenue requirement and you determine based on various criteria, and I'll try to resist getting into the weeds about that, who should pay how much. Now, of course, it's all one system, and the total cost of the system are shared. And so there is no one right way to divide those joint costs. Again, these are essentially the fixed costs of the system. So this is where your comment earlier, Donovan, about this being really about policy comes in. How we divide up the pie in terms of the revenue requirement, according to a cost of service study, determines which ratepayers pick up how much of that pie, right? How big each slice is. So that's a cost of service study. And then the last piece is called rate design. And rate design determines how costs are recovered within a given slice of that pie. So for example, residential customers, this is the easiest example. We all have a monthly fixed charge on our bills. It's called a customer charge, and we pay that whether we use 0 or 1,000 kilowatt hours a month. And then there's this thing called an energy charge, and that is the mechanism by which costs are allocated to customers associated with the fixed cost of the system. So if I consume 0 kilowatt hours in a month, my energy charges will be 0 on my bill. And if I consume 1,000 kilowatt hours in a month, it'll be 1,000 times whatever the energy charge is. We can call it 13 cents, in which case my energy charges for the month would be, say, $130. Other customer classes also have these things called demand charges. We can get that in a minute, but broadly speaking, how we chop up in rate design, how we're recovering costs, has an important effect on the incentives that consumers have to make various sorts of investments, whether they invest in energy efficiency or rooftop solar, or whether they have incentive to actually use a whole lot more electricity. The easiest example of this is if we think about our water utility here in Anchorage. The Anchorage water utility, AWWU, does not have meters for pretty much most of its customers. So most of us pay a fixed rate for water and for sewer, regardless of how much we use. And that means somebody who's got a 5-acre lot on hillside and extensive watering and gardening operations and uses a ton of water, assuming that they're on water service, they're going to pay the same amount on a monthly basis as someone who's in a condominium. A single person on a fixed income in a small condominium. And that's how rate design works for water. So that the costs are essentially just fixed that way. What that means, of course, is that there's very little disincentive for using a lot of water. And maybe that's not a big deal in terms of conservation in Alaska, because we're blessed with a pretty big water resource here, at least right now. But other places where water is scarce, like California, have comparatively low customer charges and put most of the cost recovery on how much water you use. And in fact, there are rapidly escalating charges for using more water rather than less.
And I'll just chime in here to add that that neither AARP or REAP is taking issue with the overall revenue requirement. What we're interested in and opposed to is the proposal for the way those costs have been allocated. And I think the other thing that we share is this moment in time and this perspective that we're at an important inflection point with this particular general rate case, because 80% of Chugach Electric's energy load comes from the gas supply in Cook Inlet, and the contracted gas supply is by all studies and by all admissions going to run out in very few years. And so this is a precedent-setting case.
Got it. So just to sort of play that back then, as you mentioned, rate design in this instance is a way to try and incentivize certain consumer behaviors. And then it sounds like, Marge, what you're speaking to is we could align those incentives in a way that helps us to try and address this gas crisis.
Yeah, and and to protect different customer classes or treat customer classes fairly now and going forward.
So, I mean, that leads me to a few questions just in terms of what REAP and AARP have chosen to do. But one question I wanted to ask before then too, just to give us a sense for this pivotal moment and how unique it is to have this general rate case happening right now at the same time as we're considering solutions to the gas crisis in Cook Inlet. How frequent are general rate cases? If either of you could sort of share when the most recent one was and how long it sort of typically goes between one rate case to the next.
So I mentioned before that Alaska is unusual in terms of that we regulate co-ops. It's also unusual in terms of how we regulate co-ops. Normally, if Chugach were a for-profit utility, in which if it charged too much in rates, the too much would go to the benefit of their investors, at the expense of ratepayers. And in that sort of a scheme, investor-owned utilities typically they can't change their rates without a rate case. And so we would have a rate case every 2 to 3 years, typically. The co-ops have the ability to adjust their base rates more frequently. As long as they don't try to raise them too much too fast, they can adjust their base rates actually every 3 months through what's called a simplified rate filing. And as a result, we tend not to have general rate cases unless and until there are large capital additions that are made. Chugach hasn't had a general rate case in something like 8 years. Before that, it was more than 10, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but in general, rate cases are few and far between. Interestingly enough, for example, Antony Scott Electric, even when they added EGS, their generation plant, and went out on their own from under Chugach as a wholesale customer, they filed a general rate case and the commission didn't suspend it. And those rates were allowed to go through without a hearing. I mean, MEA hasn't had a general rate case in a very, very long time. Same thing for Homer. It's been a very long time.
But Chugach Electric had one in what, 2020, and the predecessor of MLNP was 2017, or is it vice versa?
Yeah, so MLNP had a general rate case in 2017, which was required for them to be able to recover the cost of Plant 2A, which is a major new plant addition. So they had one then, and their MLNP's base rates haven't changed since that time. Which, I mean, I guess 2018 is when 2017, I think that final order came out. Chugach acquired MLNP in 2020, but they haven't had a general rate case in which you look at everything all at once, including a reshuffling of cost of service and rate design, since I believe it's 2015. My recollection had been it was even earlier than that, but I was corrected recently. So Chugach's base rates did adjust in 2020, Marge, you're right. So that or maybe it was even 2019 through the simplified rate filing process, but we haven't had a global look at cost of service and rate design certainly since 2015. Typically, cost of service is not litigated very hard, and that's because it is unusual for folks like REAP and AARP to participate. In Chugach's last general rate case, there was a lot of there was significant litigation around Chugach's transmission tariffs. That is, what they charge third parties for using their transmission lines to move power. And in this rate case, we expect there will also be significant litigation around that question, because they are proposing to raise their transmission rates for third parties by over 27%. And so
those third parties being primarily other utilities on the rail belt. That's
right. That's exactly right. And so
so it's a broader statewide impact than just Anchorage customers.
That's right. So that now, again, this is dividing up the cost of the pie, right? So if Golden Valley customers have to pay a 27% increase for the use of using Chugach's transmission lines, that means that Anchorage-based ratepayers will pay somewhat less of a rate increase than they otherwise would, right? So if you, now, in terms of like REAP's mission, which is to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency, transmission rates are actually kind of a big deal, because renewable resources are not always next to the load centers, the people that want to acquire that energy. And so as a general matter, wheeling rates or transmission rates are a disincentive for renewable energy development. I think in this case, we're unlikely to take, we haven't decided fully, but I think we are unlikely to pursue positions around the transmission rates in terms of any pre-file testimony, in part because both Homer and Golden Valley are participating in this and will be able to muster resources on those questions. And they can represent their position very well. Thank you very much.
Okay, and so just to sort of summarize before I move us into my next question that I have for you, this is a rare opportunity. You've sort of also mentioned, both of you, the moment that we're in here in Anchorage, but also on the rail belt more broadly in terms of running out of the fuel that we use to generate a lot of our electricity, also a lot of our heat on the rail belt. And so it's timely to sort of be thinking about where energy comes from and then also the incentives that align around that. So I think we'll get into that more deeply, but I also just wanted to ask a background question related to Chugach's current rate case proposal or their rate design proposal before going deeper into the responses that both REAP and AARP have mounted. So I'm just curious if you could give us an overview of Chugach's current proposal and how that's going to impact rates and also ratepayers.
I can't hear you, Donovan.
Could you, oh, sorry, I'll play that back. So I'm just curious, before we dive into how REAP and AARP are both responding to Chugach's proposal as it's currently written and as submitted to the RCA, could you just give us an overview of how Chugach's proposed rate design would change rates and impact ratepayers?
Well, again, as I said, they have a general proposal to increase their revenue by a little over 8%. A portion of their proposed allocation would raise rates for transmission by over 27%. One of the tasks that they were given by the commission in their acquisition order was to unify rates between the old ML&P district and the Southern Legacy Chugach district, so that all residential ratepayers would pay the same rates regardless of where you lived. All small commercial customers would pay the same rates regardless of where you did your business, and so forth. Chugach's proposal, so they were required to present a unified rates. Chugach, in their filing, turns out, moved towards unified rates for many customer classes, but not quite all. One of the notable things in terms of, say, residential ratepayers that they've done, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but they propose raising the customer charge for Chugach South customers, that is the legacy Chugach territory, as opposed to the ML&P territory, raising the customer charge from $8 a month, which it had been, to $1367 a month, I think. So they seek to recover a much bigger proportion of the revenue from residential customers through monthly customer charges. One of the kind of salutary things that they've done in terms of ML&P's legacy service territory is they've gotten rid of what used to be called a demand ratchet, which is where a large commercial customer, whatever their instantaneous demand was for power over a 15-minute interval, they would be charged demand charges for a full 3 months based on whatever that 15-minute interval was. And they've gotten rid of that ratchet so that now demand charges are based on the instantaneous 15 minutes within a given month. So, I mean, that's an example of some of the sort of shifts that have happened. But again, it's hard to get into that without like kind of having everybody's eyes glaze over. And as well, to really understand it requires sort of staring at the proposal for a long period of time. And even then, it's tricky because there are so many different service tariff offerings in each service territory. But I think from my perspective, one of the things as a former commissioner, one of the things that surprised me is that Chugach has not sought to fully unify rates between the North and South districts. And indeed, what really surprises me is their proposal maintains separate tariff sheets for, even for the rates that are being unified, it maintains separate tariff sheets for those customers in the South and those customers in the North, which is unfortunate because it's going to increase their long-term regulatory costs if the commission were to approve that proposal.
Yeah, and I appreciate, as I promised the audience, we will try not to go too far into the weeds, but I think that just sort of illustrates that this is a very complicated process. And again, very glad to have you two experts working on this. And I think sort of what I was driving towards is obviously Chugach's current proposal is not to the liking of REAP and AARP. That's why we're holding this webinar, and that's why we're getting involved here. And so I was just more broadly curious how the proposal is misaligned with the missions of our individual organizations. And then I hope that you might just sort of share in the context of that, what your individual organizations have now decided to do in response. So I could, if either of you wants to attack that first, maybe Marge.
First.
I'll go ahead and start. So AARP is fighting to prevent unfair residential utility hikes. So we're specifically focused on residential. Again, we represent customers over 50, and we advocate on behalf of all residential customers on utility matters. So AARP Alaska has formally intervened in the Chugach Electric rate case now before the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, because we see this as an important inflection point, as mentioned, for Anchorage energy utility cost allocations. Because we know that it could be precedent setting when rates are increased again as Cook Inlet contracted gas supply runs short. And that's perhaps what I didn't say earlier related to the Cook Inlet gas supply, is that when that contracted gas supply runs short, then what's going to be done is importing of liquid natural gas, and that is much more expensive than local gas supply. So we know that this is precedent setting. We are primarily concerned that residential customers be treated fairly and are not required to subsidize other customer classes. And we want to make sure there's someone at the table who's ensuring that residential households are treated fairly as cost increases are allocated both now and in the future. So we're taking on that role because we know that rate increases will most impact those on fixed and low incomes. Especially in these inflationary times, any increase can be a burden to our members. Utility bills contribute to overall housing costs, which are already soaring in Anchorage. And utility rates are an essential pocketbook issue for older Alaskans and their families, many of whom struggle to pay their utility bills as well as other household expenses like food and medicine. Many of our members are, AARP Alaska members are on low and or fixed incomes, including 12% of our members who rely on Social Security checks for 90% or more of their monthly income. 32% additionally, for whom 50% or more of their monthly income is from their Social Security check. So as a point of reference, in Alaska, the average Social Security retired worker benefit is less than $1,500 a month. So that's why, even though to an individual of a certain income, maybe the dollars that we're talking about in terms of increases are not significant, they are for many folks. And we see this as Chugach's rate filing and communications also misrepresent the amount of the rate change for their 90,000 customers. And our members are 30,000 of those folks. So while Chugach represents that its request is for a 6% electric rate increase, that's the public communications message. The actual percentages, as Antony described, depend on the customer class and location in Anchorage. And Chugach has proposed to increase that fixed customer charge that customers pay before even turning on the lights for the majority of residential customers by more than 70%, while other customer classes would receive decreased fixed charges. Seniors tend to live in smaller households and use less electricity. So fixed charges disproportionately impact seniors and older Alaskan households. And likewise, AARP is concerned that the largest rate increases are proposed for residents with the lowest usage. Antony will get into this a little more, I'm sure, from REAP's perspective of energy conservation, but the percentage increase for residential households would be the greatest for those who have the least usage. Customers with 200 kilowatt hours usage per month would see their rates increase by more than 16%, while those with 1,000 kilowatt hours, the highest level usage per month, would see their rates increase by half that at 8%. And this rate structure is unjustified and unfairly impacts older households because, again, seniors tend to use less electricity than others do.
I'd like to jump on that just a little bit. So there was a question just asked, which I haven't addressed yet, which is, well, Chugach was ordered to file unified rates and they chose not to do so. Why not? And the answer, and this is sort of piggybacking on Marge's answer just now, the answer was because rate increases for their proposed cost of service, which then divides up the pie among customer classes, the rate increase for as divided for small commercial customers in Chugach's legacy service territory would have been on the order of 20-something%. So big potential rate increase. And so to prevent that, Chugach said, well, that's too big a rate increase for those customers to bear. So what we instead will do is ask residential ratepayers, both in the north and south, to increase their rates a little bit more than what we would have, what our cost of service study proposes, to make up the difference in our required revenue. But as Marge points out, the burden of doing that is falling on those folks, particularly heavily in Chugach's South District, who use very little energy. So you get issues of fairness necessarily in these discussions always. REAP's main focus in this rate case is on designing rates to encourage energy efficiency and adoption of rooftop solar. Obviously, increasing customer charges in the way that Chugach has done for residential ratepayers is not very helpful in that regard. We'd like to see more of the cost shifted into the energy charge because that creates incentives to consume less energy. I would point out that none of the rail belt utilities has ever engaged in rate design that is, or frankly, energy efficiency programs designed to conserve electricity. It's just not been a major focus. In America, it tends to be in most states. That is, there's significant encouragement to get utilities to encourage their customers to use less energy. And the reason why is because if we use less energy, then costs for everybody collectively end up being lower. And that's especially the case for us at this point with Cook Inlet natural gas running short. And the substitute fuel, which would be liquefied natural gas, which is what folks are planning towards, is going to be much more expensive. We've had two independent consultant reports, both assess that, roughly speaking, the cost of natural gas is going to increase by something like 50%. It's also the case that Chugach's own consultant has said that if we were to engage in serious demand side management, we could potentially extend the date on which we need to start importing natural gas by 4 to 5 years. That strikes me as kind of a big deal because it gives us an opportunity to install more utility scale renewable energy generation and effectuate the transition that is being afforded to us through the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives that have been offered there. Because it could be a very long time before we get another general rate case in which we redesign rates, I think it's really important that we try to get a rate design in this rate case that kind of changes the paradigm. I will also say, like, REAP chose whether or not it would get involved very carefully. It's incredibly expensive to participate in these proceedings. And it's taken a lot of effort for us to be able to get there. We would not be able to do that, by the way, without the assistance of Earth Justice, who has agreed to be our attorneys on a pro bono basis. So shout out to them. But it's one of the main reasons why we're getting involved is because there is a statute. In fact, it's the only statute governing rate design in the Alaska Public Utilities Act, which says that the commission shall establish, in the establishment of rates, the commission shall promote the conservation of resources used in the generation of electricity. That's pretty strong language. And we think that the commission hasn't previously paid a lot of attention to it because nobody's asked them to. We're going to ask them to and file proposals consistent with that dictate. And especially given where we're at right now in terms of Cook Inlet energy, natural gas supply, we think we got a fighting chance to begin to turn the ship on this question.
Well, thank you. I mean, really important, time-bound, unique opportunity, and two really important perspectives on why to intervene to have an impact on rate design that will seemingly be in place here for the near future. And it brings to mind now what is next for me. What does the rest of this process look like? When will ultimate decisions be made? When will sort of the final ruling be released in terms of what rate design is established here at Chugach? Can you delineate that for us a bit?
I think that's something that's unusual in this case compared to other states as well, in that it's very long. And Antony can give you the details.
Well, it's most places actually it's a fairly long process, and the reason why is because it's litigated, and so everybody needs due process. So by statute, the commission is required to issue a decision about Chugach's filed rate proposal 450 days after the date of filing. So that means the commission will issue a final order roughly a year from now, actually a little bit less than a year from now, very early October, I think. We are anxiously awaiting the commission's order granting or denying intervener status to the various parties that have petitioned to intervene. You have to raise your hand and say, we want to be a part of this party, and we think we have important things to say, and here's why, and please let us. Once that happens, the commission will have a pre-hearing conference at which the rest of the schedule for the proceedings will unfold. As a general matter, the commission likes to have at least 90 days after a hearing to issue an order. So if an order needs to go out in early October, that means we're going to have a hearing which would last much of the month of June. Before that hearing, there are two other steps. One, interveners will have an opportunity to file responsive testimony to Chugach's case in chief. My hunch is that responsive testimony will be due sometime in early March. That gives us time to do discovery and find out more about what behind Chugach's filing. Then there will be a discovery period on interveners' testimony. And Chugach will ask us all discovery questions. And then Chugach will have an opportunity to file reply testimony. And I expect that to happen no later than early February. There'll be probably a month between, sorry, I said February, I meant May. There will be probably a month between when Chugach files their reply testimony and the beginning of the hearing. 3 to 4 weeks, probably.
And just to go backwards, the initial filing was what, July 1st, and they already did the public comment period.
That's right.
And so the public's already weighed in, and it's not, to my understanding, it's not mandatory that there is public comment required from here forward. And that's why the intervening parties are so important to represent customers.
No, that's exactly right. Public comment does not really play much of a role anymore. The commission will need to make its ultimate decision based on the record in front of it, which is established by the parties. And so that's why intervener status is so important. It gives you the opportunity to file testimony and do discovery and cross-examine witnesses and so on. It also comes with certain responsibilities in terms of having discovery filed on one and burdens. So I would say the thing that's pretty exciting in this rate case is we have had, I think it's 13 people petitioned to intervene in this rate case. 13 people, parties, ranging the gamut of a particular individual to AARP, REAP, some property owners have filed to intervene. The military base has filed to intervene. Other rail belt utilities have filed to intervene. NSTAR has filed to intervene. So it's a wider group than we're usually used to seeing, which is normally restricted to very large customers and other utilities. And the restriction is not any legal restriction. The restriction tends to just be about resources. Mm-hmm. It's expensive to play. It's pretty technical. So I can tell you, I am overjoyed at the number of folks who are, as a former commissioner, at the number of folks who are choosing to play, because the commission can't make a good decision if it doesn't have a broad and deep record. It can only make a decision based on the record in front of it. And if the record in front of it is sparse, it doesn't have much to go on, which is why it's so important for many perspectives to be brought to the fore. I think I started at the very beginning talking about what a rate case is and that it's a litigated proceeding in front of this administrative body. We, not just in Alaska, every state does this. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission does this as well. These proceedings are an opportunity to give voice to the public to weigh in on these important questions. And they're policy questions. And so if people don't play, they get the results that they get. One thing that I would encourage everybody on the line, though, also to remember is that Chugach is a member-owned cooperative. And it is supposed to be responsive to the desires of its members. Typically, there's not a huge amount of membership engagement. And if people want their co-op to do different things, they need to engage their board of directors and show up at meetings and provide their own views of what we, who are the owners of the co-op, want to see happen.
And on that note, we have a list of questions here from the audience as well. So always encouraging participation, want to make sure that we respond to those, but perhaps maybe just briefly, just sort of sum it up. As you mentioned, really important moment here with a unique opportunity to try and have an impact on how rates are recovered. And then by virtue of that, how we align our incentives to try and dictate how we conserve or use our electricity, how folks are impacted by the rates that are imposed on them, and ultimately what our future looks like here in the Chugach service territory, and as you alluded to, also on the rail belt more broadly. Could you just sort of sum it up again for us before we go into questions, what your individual organizations are hoping to achieve at a broad level with your intervention in this rate case?
So AARP is intervening to represent the interests of its members and other residential households that would bear a disproportionately large burden under the proposed Chugach cost allocation and rate design. And we seek to minimize these threats to financial security, especially for those on fixed and or lower incomes.
At REAP's main focus, again, our mission is to encourage renewable energy development and energy efficiency in Alaska. People respond to prices. And so the prices are going to be set. The prices for electricity are going to be set, and the pricing mechanism is going to be set in this rate case. So this is a powerful opportunity to harness consumer behavior to help determine how we collectively use electricity and the kind of investments that we make. REAP's focus is broader than AARP's in that we're not focused only on residential consumers, but we're focused more generally on the pricing signals across customer classes that are sent and the incentives that are then subsequently created across different customer classes to make investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy. And the renewable energy really is going to be things like rooftop solar. We haven't, potentially things like cogeneration in terms of the installation of microturbines by commercial or industrial parties, which both have opportunity to heat buildings and generate electricity. And so there's an opportunity there to reduce cooking with natural gas, again, conserve resources used in the generation of electricity. So.
All righty. So to address some of our questions, the first one here, I think I know the answer to. It says Chugach has posted the proposed new rate schedules. Could AARP and REAP publish their alternate proposals? You alluded to the process earlier, Antony, so that if available, won't come for a little while here.
No, that's right. We don't have a proposal yet. We need to learn much more about Chugach's proposal and underlying data that Chugach was relying upon before we develop firm positions. We will do that when we file our pre-filed responsive testimony, which again, I expect will happen early March, hopefully not much sooner than that, maybe late February. The later for us, the better.
And from AARP's perspective, I'm not going to speak for our attorney on the level of detail that we're going to provide in our comments. We may not be proposing a specific rate design, but opposing the one that's been presented for the reasons that I've stated.
Thank you. I might lump two of these together, or maybe not. The first one is, has there been any discussion of moving to time of service or time of use rates?
That's a really good question, and the answer is yes. In fact, Chugach in its proposed rate design is offering an incentive, an inception rate, which would be open to 500 residential and small commercial customers to move to time of use rates. And so this would be
essentially it's a pilot.
It is a pilot project. One of the things that I noticed right off the bat is that the pilot project is not available to anybody who has rooftop solar. So if you have rooftop solar, you cannot sign up for time of use rates, which from my perspective really is an enormous mistake, especially for designing a pilot, because in terms of adopters, there tends to be a fair amount of complementarity between the folks who want to drive electric vehicles and the folks who want to install rooftop solar. Certainly once you install rooftop solar, there's this huge benefit of being able to drive on sunshine. So I will say that the time of use, what's very interesting about Chugach's time of use proposal is that their own testimony suggests there's very little cost difference between the cost of generating for them, for Chugach Electric, between the cost of generating electricity at peak and the cost of generating off peak. Their consultant couldn't come up with a truly cost-based basis for that. And the reason for that is that Chugach has way more generation than they need. And the cost of generation is very flat across their units that actually get called on. So their time of use proposal is, I have a lot of questions about it in terms of whether this particularly makes sense. I think it is primarily designed to increase load. It's designed to provide modest potential savings for those who drive electric vehicles, to encourage those folks to consume more.
I think you froze. We better move on.
Yeah. Let's see.
But hopefully he'll come back because he's going to be better able to answer the question.
But again, that's something that we need to look at further.
All righty. Let's see. A next one. This is more of a comment, but I think it sort of leads to a question or a point that wasn't quite illustrated. The commenter says, energy efficiency makes much more sense for commercial accounts than residential because of scale and usually much better return on investment. So if you charge more for commercial accounts, there are built-in incentives to invest in energy efficiency. So perhaps alluding to potential tweaks to rate design to align those incentives that you alluded to earlier, Antony.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I want to also know, in terms of one of the questions that's been asked a couple times, is, hey, if you charge people for using more, like above 500 kilowatt hours, you charge a higher rate. Then for the consumption below that, that's called increasing block rates. And it's definitely something that is something that we will be looking at.
Righty. Well, we don't have much more time here. I will ask one more question because I think it's pertinent to what has already happened for folks and the impact on their rates, and then I'll sum it up. But one final question: did Chugach's interim rate increase go into effect yet?
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. All righty. Well, there are so many other questions. I really appreciate the engagement from the crowd here today. We had a lot of people on today, which is a reflection not only of the importance of this topic, but also the expertise of our speakers. So once again, wanted to thank Marge for joining us from AARP. If you want to learn more about them and their efforts, please visit aarp.org. Also wanted to thank Antony for joining us. You probably know how to reach REAP, but our website is alaskarenewableenergy.org if you want to learn more about us. one-click plug. Again, this is all policy work, and so we have great partners, member organizations, state, federal, and also agency support. A lot of this policy work is supported by individual donors like you. So really wanted to shout out our awesome individual supporters. And if you're interested in this work, think it's important, please take a look at our website and consider contributing. Final plug to Cook Inlet Region Inc. Siri for supporting this series. We've got more coming up. This is the first of 4. I'll put a link here in the chat for the second installment in case folks want to learn more about that and register to attend 2 weeks from today, again from noon to 1 p.m. But want to respect your time. It is the hour on the dot here, so I think we did a good job of sort of wrapping up in a timely fashion. Thank you both for joining us today. Thank you everyone for joining us on Alaska Day, and please enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.